James Gunn didn't lie about Paradise Lost. He just made a promise about 4 months before the green light sheet quietly vetoed it. Because this week, Variety reported that 2 more projects from Gunn's original DC Universe slate are no longer being actively developed. First, there's Waller, the Amanda Waller series built around Viola Davis, and Paradise Lost, the Wonder Woman prequel Gunn once described as Game of Thrones set on Themyscira. Now, to be precise, neither show had received an official series order, so calling them canceled is technically stronger than what happened. They were announced, they were developed, they were reportedly discussed as parts of the DCU. And now, they're no longer active priorities. Now, that is a cancellation. It's the Hollywood version of being removed from the family group chat without anyone explaining why. What makes this more than another development story is what James Gunn told fans just 4 months ago. Back in April, people asked him directly whether Paradise Lost and Booster Gold were still happening. His answer was, Booster Gold is in development. Paradise Lost is in extreme development. Extreme. Extreme was doing Olympic-level lifting in that sentence. Because 4 months later, extreme development has apparently become no longer in active development. And Booster Gold hasn't exactly had a great summary either. The version being developed by our Flag Means Death creator David Jenkins is reportedly no longer moving forward, with the project now potentially searching for a new creative direction. So one project went from extreme development to the shelf. The other went from in development to being rebuilt without the person developing it. Welcome back to The Critical Nerd, where we keep our expectations low and our receipts high. To understand why this matters, we need to go all the way back to January of 2023. That was when James Gunn and Peter Safran unveiled the opening slate of their new DC universe. Chapter One, Gods and Monsters. 10 projects were presented, 5 movies and 5 television shows. You had Superman Legacy, which then became James Gunn's Superman. The Authority, The Brave and the Bold, Supergirl, Woman of Tomorrow, Swamp Thing. Then over on the television side, you had Creature Commandos, Waller, Lanterns, Paradise Lost, and Booster Gold. This wasn't presented as a random wish list. It was presented as the foundation of a connected universe, one planned across film, television, animation, and gaming, with actors potentially carrying their roles between formats. After years of DC changing directions, replacing executives, abandoning storylines, and treating continuity like an optional subscription feature, Gunn and Safran were selling stability. There was finally a plan. That was the pitch. And to Gunn's credit, he also said projects would not move forward until receipts were ready. Well, it's a sensible policy. Hollywood has spent years announcing release dates before scripts existed and then acting surprised when the finished movie looked like it was written during a fire drill. A script-first approach is exactly what DC should be doing. But there's a difference between refusing to rush a weak script and publicly announcing a project before knowing whether the creative foundation exists. If 3 years later, half your founding slate is delayed, dormant, being redeveloped, or quietly removed from active development, then the original presentation wasn't really a production slate. It was a list of intentions wearing matching logos. So let's audit the original 10 projects. Not according to promotional enthusiasm, according to what has actually reached or is about to reach the audience. Creature Commandos premiered on HBO Max in December of 2024. Superman followed in summer of 2025. Supergirl arrived this past summer. And Lanterns premieres this coming Sunday on HBO Max. That gives DC 3 release projects from the original presentation, with the 4th arriving this weekend. Those are the survivors. Now let's look at the other 6. The Authority was shelved after Gunn said the screenplay wasn't quite working and the project no longer fit properly into the larger DCU. That's one project officially off the board. Now Waller and Paradise Lost are no longer being actively developed. That moves the count to 3. Booster Gold may still exist in theory, but the David Jenkins version is no longer moving forward. Reports suggest DC could continue with a different creative team, which means the title might survive even if the original version did not. That leaves the Brave and the Bold and Swamp Thing. Both may eventually happen, but neither has a production date and neither appears close to cameras. So the original 10 project slate currently looks like this: 3 released, 1 arriving Sunday, 3 shelved or no longer active, 1 being creatively rebuilt, and 2 sitting somewhere in the fog of long-term development. That does not mean the entire DCU is collapsing, even though some, including myself, said after Supergirl the DCU is dead. It does mean the certainty surrounding that original announcement has evaporated, because a slate isn't defined by how many logos appear during the presentation. It's defined by how many projects survived the development process. Of the 2 newly inactive projects, Waller is probably the least surprising of them. The show was supposed to follow Amanda Waller after the first season of Peacemaker, with Viola Davis returning to the role. But then the schedule changed. Waller was delayed by the Hollywood strikes, while Peacemaker Season 2 moved forward and began absorbing some of the story that the Waller series may have been designed to carry. That creates a practical problem. If Peacemaker can handle the important Amanda Waller material, why produce a separate prestige series around her? Especially when DC is already committing enormous television resources to Lanterns and has other shows competing for the same audience, budgets, and release windows. From a business perspective, consolidating those stories makes sense. Viola Davis can still appear throughout the DCU without Warner Brothers spending tens of millions of dollars creating an entire series around her. The project may not have failed creatively. It may simply have become redundant. That is the reasonable explanation. But it also reveals how quickly the architecture of the supposedly coordinated universe can change. Waller wasn't some rumor Gunn inherited from the old regime. He announced it as one of the 5 television pillars of Chapter One. Now the DCU has apparently discovered it can tell that story without the pillar. And then Paradise Lost. Well, that's the stranger case. This was supposed to explore Themyscira before Wonder Woman's birth, focusing on the political conflicts, power struggles, and history of the Amazons. Gunn compared the concept to Game of Thrones. That description alone made it one of the more ambitious projects on the slate. It also made it one of the most expensive. A fantasy drama set entirely on Themyscira requires large sets, extensive costumes, visual effects, and an ensemble cast, all for a series without Wonder Woman herself as the central selling point. That's a difficult pitch even when the superhero market is healthy. It becomes much more difficult when the studios are cutting streaming budgets and demanding that every franchise project justify its existence immediately. There's also the question of DC's larger Wonder Woman strategy. The studio has not formally introduced its new Diana. Producing a costly Themyscira prequel before audiences admit the DCU's Wonder Woman would mean spending years constructing the mythology around a character who hasn't arrived yet. It's not impossible, but it is backwards. Marvel could make WandaVision because audiences already knew Wanda. HBO can make House of the Dragon because Game of Thrones had already built the audience. Paradise Lost would have been asking viewers to become invested in Wonder Woman's homeland before DC had given them its Wonder Woman. Maybe someone finally noticed the cart was 2 movies ahead of the horse. Again, pausing the project may be the responsible decision. The problem is that fans asked whether it was in trouble, and Gunn didn't describe it as pause, uncertain, or awaiting the right script. He called it extreme development. 4 months later, it was no longer being actively developed. This is where the story becomes less about 2 television shows and more about James Gunn's communication strategy. Gunn has built his relationship with fans around accessibility. He answers questions directly. He corrects rumors. He explains production decisions. And compared with the usual studio wall of silence, that openness can be refreshing. But constant communication creates its own credibility problem. Film and television development is fluid. Projects change, writers leave, budgets collapse, executives change priorities. What appears viable in April may be dead by August, and that's normal. But when the co-CEO of the studio publicly reassures fans every time they ask about a project, temporary intentions begin sounding like guarantees. In development does not mean greenlit. Being written does not mean being produced. And apparently extreme development does not mean it will still be active by the end of the summer. Gunn may have been completely truthful when he posted that answer. Paradise Lost may genuinely have been receiving significant attention at that moment, but if the status can reverse within 4 months, then the responsible answer is not a confident reassurance. It is, we're still working on it, but nothing moves forward until the script and budget are right. That answer is less exciting. It's also much harder to turn into a receipt later. Here's the part where I give DC just a little tiny credit. Reducing the number of projects is not automatically a sign of disaster. In fact, it may be the smartest thing Gunn and Safran have done since taking over. Shared universes become bloated because studios confuse volume with momentum. More shows, more characters, more post-credit scenes, advertising other post-credit scenes. Eventually, audiences stopped watching everything because watching everything began to feel like, homework. DC does not need 5 simultaneous television productions. It needs a few excellent projects that make people want the next one. If Waller was redundant, shelve it. If Paradise Lost was too expensive or the script wasn't working, pause it. If the authority wasn't ready, don't make it. Those are responsible decisions. But responsible contraction does not erase irresponsible overpromising. The original Chapter 1 announcement was designed to project confidence. Now, project by project, that confidence is being replaced by qualifiers. Not canceled, no longer active, being redeveloped, waiting for the right script, still part of the plan, but not currently moving. At a certain point, the distinction between a carefully evolving strategy and a slate that was announced too early becomes mostly a matter of public relations vocabulary. And that brings us to Lanterns, and its timing could not be more important. The series premieres this Sunday. During the same week, the public learned that 2 other shows from the original slate are no longer active. Lanterns represents the version of Gunn's strategy that actually survived development. It's got major talent, it has HBO positioning, and it's built around Green Lantern, one of the biggest pieces of DC mythology that Warner Brothers has spent more than a decade avoiding after one bad movie convinced the studio that apparently the entire color green was cursed. If Lanterns works, DC can argue that the shrinking slate reflects quality control. The weaker or less necessary concepts were removed so resources could be concentrated on the projects with the strongest scripts and the best chance of succeeding. That's a coherent strategy. If Lanterns does not connect, the interpretation becomes much less flattering. Then DC hasn't been narrowing its focus around winners, it has simply been producing fewer projects without solving the underlying problem. Now, we will get the first audience reaction this weekend. We'll not have definitive streaming numbers by Monday, regardless of what the usual anonymous insiders claim after examining 3 screenshots and the vibes coming from parking lot B on the Warner Brothers lot. But we will know whether the series has generated genuine excitement. And right now, DC needs excitement that lasts longer than an announcement video. James Gunn's DC universe is definitely at a crossroads. There are those out there like me who, after Supergirl, proclaim that the DCU is dead. Some would say James Gunn's DC universe is not dead. It's being reduced to the projects that can survive actual development. That may ultimately result in a stronger franchise, but it also exposes the original Chapter 1 slate for what it really was. An ambitious roadmap announced before DC knew how many roads were actually open. Out of the 10 original projects, 3 have been released and the 4th arrives this Sunday. 3 are now shelved or inactive. 1 has lost its original creative direction, and 2 remain somewhere over the horizon. That is not the clean, coordinated rollout fans were promised way back in January of 2023. It is a studio discovering its plan in public. The issue is not that Gunn changed course. Good executives change course when a project isn't working. The issue is that he continues describing uncertain development with the confidence of a green light. Paradise Lost was not merely alive, it was in extreme development until it wasn't. The DCU does not need another 10-year presentation. It needs Lanterns to work. It needs Clayface to work. And above all, it needs Man of Tomorrow to deliver the home run this universe needs. Not a single like Superman. Because cinematic universes are not built by announcing 10 projects. They are built by making audiences care about the first one, then the next one, then the one after that. Everything else is just a PowerPoint. Keep your expectations low and your receipts high. I'm the Critical Nerd, and I am out.